You are watching Co-op for Two. My name is Jesse Rykor, and today we're going to be looking at Gumshoe, a 1985 out-of-print game inspired by Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. Now, before I get started, I should say that there are several Gumshoe videos on the channel. There are three playthroughs of the first 3 days. The day one took about 7 hours, day two 6 hours, 5 hours, so very long playthroughs. There's an unboxing because this is such a rare game. I did a long unboxing and look at all the components in detail, so I won't be repeating that. I think what I'm going to do is do a very quick review first here, maybe 15 minutes to give my thoughts. And then we'll do a separate video, a very deep dive into the mechanics and how well they worked, and looking at it a little bit from a game design perspective. So let's try to keep this short. Gumshoe was created by Grady. He was the brains behind it, and he and Suzanne Goldberg, who did much of the writing in this as well, created Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, maybe in 81, this is 85, 81, 82, Sherlock Holmes, and then that spawned a bunch of expansions and continues to this day. The last expansion, which I've played on the channel, is the Baker Street Irregulars, written by Dave Neal. Those cases are amazing, and I'll talk a little bit about them more in comparison to this. But anyway, Gumshoe was a much more ambitious, epic-scoped game set in the 1930s, sort of film noir, hard-boiled detective set in the 1930s. And it didn't quite catch on, and there are reasons for that. But mostly because it's so ambitious, but it's like running a marathon, and not everyone can run a marathon, and playing the game feels a bit exhausting. It's a real test of your stamina. It's 9 days. The cases don't start and end on a day. They're not isolated to a day. So it's 9 days during which new cases get introduced and continue throughout the days. It's more epic and more ambitious in every way. We'll talk about that. But it's really a game for sort of aficionados of this genre of game. And maybe I should back up and talk a little bit about that for those who aren't familiar with Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. Essentially, each scenario, each day, or each case in Sherlock Holmes has a set of paragraphs that are numbered. In Gumshoe, they are actual numbers, clues 1 through 430 or so, and they're all in this book here. In the later editions of Sherlock Holmes, each case is its own little book. And generally, the entries in that book are by location. In Sherlock Holmes, you've got a much simpler map, and you might say, well, let me go here and see. You read an introduction about a case, and you say, well, let me go to the crime scene. And so you say, okay, the crime scene occurred at 34 Northeast, and you look that up in the book in Sherlock Holmes, and you read a little paragraph or sometimes a full page, what the person told you at that location or what you saw, and then you gradually unfold the mystery and figure out things. You go to one place, you'll get new ideas of where to go. Same basic system in Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective and in Gumshoe. In a normal Sherlock Holmes case, there's no time mechanic. You simply play until you've figured out all the places you want to go. There are certain locations that are available in every case, like little informants. You might go talk to the cab drivers and see if they've picked up anyone that they remember on an interesting ride. That might give you clues. And there's some deductive detective work, figuring out, well, if this person robbed this store, they had to escape on this route, so let me go check that route. Or maybe they were on drugs, so maybe I should talk to the chemists. you play until you think you figure out the solution to the case. Then you read some questions at the end, which will challenge whether you figured out everything you should have figured out. Then you'll read the solution and you'll see how close you came to the solution. And in Sherlock Holmes, you'll compare how many turns it took you, how many leads you had to read, and the less leads you had to read, the better score, if you care about score. Sherlock Holmes is set in the 1800s. Gumshoe is set in 1930s. And there are differences with Gumshoe. So let's talk a little bit about those differences. A main source of differences is the way you look up locations. I should say there's not going to be any spoilers in this review. In Sherlock Holmes, you've got a map that's the same for all the different cases. And it's a very stylized, simplified map of London. Every place has a little number. And on the map, when you look at it, you can see certain known buildings are clearly illustrated. Other locations just represent the block. In Gumshoe, you can see it's got this gigantic map of San Francisco. It looks like a real world map, not a map specifically made for the game. And not individual locations. So when you want to look up something, everything will be by its real address. So, for example, on the first day, some of the locations are 1023 Broadway, 545 Clippard, 22 Fairfield Way. So on any given day, you're given an actual list. They're called clue points. And you're given a list of possible locations, usually locations, but some things that are slightly different. But this clue point list, which is the key difference in this game, gives you your total possibility of locations you might visit and get information of. In Sherlock Holmes, you don't have that. Sort of every point on the map could be an entry, and you look it up, and maybe there's no entry for that location. It's not relevant for your case, and you just move on. Here, these are all the potential locations. You could just walk through these one by one and read the paragraph, but that would be cheating. Essentially, what you should do is you should have a reason for visiting any of these places. So when you read the introduction, it might be the scene of the crime is at this location. So you'd say, okay, then I definitely want to go there. And then that might lead you to other locations. In both games, we've got a directory, a phone book. In Gumshoe, it's much larger. And in addition to the phone book for San Francisco, we've got mini phone books for Berkeley, Oakland, Palo Alto, and a bunch of other little cities. So that's actually adds a different kind of thinking. You can't just look it up one place. If you're really trying to shoot in the dark and look for someone by name, you may have to look it up in several phone books. There's also a Yellow Pages. Again, much larger than normal Sherlock Holmes, much more ambitious. Most of it you won't use, but you will have to use your brain sometime to think, well, if this person worked in a bar, then let me look up all the bars. Maybe I'll visit them and see if anyone knows them. Again, resources for figuring out where to look up leads to visit to get information. Continuing with our look at the components. So we've got our phone books. We've also got newspapers, also found in Sherlock Holmes. We've got one for each day. They're double-sided. They're large with tons of fine print. They look like real newspapers. In the new Sherlock Holmes, they're mostly just type. They don't look as real. But there's a ton of text in these newspapers, and finding relevant information is a challenge. That's part of the game. Part of the whole mechanic of the game is you're sort of inundated by text, and you'll have to search through with a fine-tooth comb looking for what's relevant for you. Most of the newspaper is not relevant. Occasionally, there'll be a story related to one of the cases you're working on. Okay, a couple more things that are different in Gumshoe. We've got a couple more mechanics, and fingerprints plays a big role in this game. You've got two things here. You've got these fingerprint files, which are organized by the fingerprint classification type, whether they're loops or whorls or arches, and then what loop 4, loop 5, loop 6. They're double-sided. And then you've got mugshots, a whole bunch of them, 20-something, which have fingerprints on them and little summaries of the police records for each of these people, their name, their demographics, their what they were arrested for, etc. And in the instruction book is a long section on how to classify and identify fingerprints. So here it is, how to read arches, loops, whorls, and it's overwhelming in the beginning. But you will find as you play this game, over the course of maybe 50 hours, 9 days, 5 hours of actual real time playing each case, could bring you 40, 50, 60 hours. You'll find you get quite good at classifying the fingerprints, and it's quite satisfying to look at a fingerprint on a clue. For example, you might go to a certain location and it'll say, okay, you can dust for fingerprints. You dust for fingerprints and you get a fingerprint, and then you'll look at it and you'll say, okay, let me guess, this is a whorl 2. I'm classifying it as a whorl 2. So then you get out your fingerprint cards, your W2 fingerprints. You look at them and you say, okay, let me match it to one of those. Which one does it match? Once you've narrowed it down to W2s, you can actually do a physical comparison and find it quite easily. And then you'll say, okay, this is fingerprint 1025. Now that I know that it's fingerprint 1025, maybe I can go look that person up in the DMV, see if they've applied for a driver's license. If so, I'll get their name. Otherwise, maybe the FBI knows them. Maybe you can't look them up, but you can match their fingerprints to the scene of the crime. Like you found some fingerprints in a house and some fingerprints at the scene of the crime. You match them up. You say, aha, same person was here at both locations. Fingerprints are very well done. In fact, there's so many of them, and they're so perfectly classified. Like the L4s are all, they're clear. Every time you find a fingerprint, you will be able to look it up and find it on one of these cards. All of the mugshots you will all have for each person have the same classification. So you will be able to look them up. They're remarkably well done, the fingerprints. It works well. I'm not sure why it's so satisfying, because it's not involving sort of deductive work. It's involving sort of process work. You're sort of, okay, I now have to go through all the fingerprints. I have to go through all the mugshots. You're sort of doing automatic grunt work, but it's satisfying. It feels like you're doing detective work. You're being rewarded for being the detective that goes through all of the parking tickets to find the serial killer who got a parking ticket while parking at the scene of the crime. You're very much rewarded for that shoe leather work. On the same line as the fingerprints are these autopsy reports and lab reports. So there's two piles of reports. They both they become available on different days and different times. The autopsy reports all have the same basic layout. There's an autopsy diagram of how the person was killed, their fingerprints, summary of cause of death, and some basic statistics. And each one tells you on what day it becomes available. So basically after the person dies, it becomes available on the next day or later that day. And then you've got these more generic lab reports, which can take different forms. Again, they're available on the day. Some of them are diagrams of the scene of the crime. Some of them are ballistic reports, photographs of the bullets that you can match up. What else? So mostly, I guess, the front page is a diagram you would imagine made by one of the detectives, and then ballistics on the back, if there are ballistics. So I don't want to dwell on these because you shouldn't be looking at this if you're going to play. But feels very real, very satisfying. quite a step beyond Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes rarely has these extra pieces of evidence or things to look at. Occasionally in the clue book for Sherlock Holmes, there'll be a paper, a written paper, or a diagram. But this game is sort of flooding you with these extra things: fingerprints, lab reports, autopsy, and it sort of overwhelms you with information. Which, if you love this genre, you will welcome. If you're already pushed to the limit, keeping information in your head with this genre, you might find a little overwhelming. And I think, so that's the components. We've talked about this giant map. There's also an additional map here, which is the outskirts of San Francisco. Both maps you rarely actually use that much. I mean, I used the first map to get a feel for where things were. There were occasionally cases where there might be a car chase or a foot chase where I put little markers on the board. But it's hard to use the map. It's a very busy map. It's a little hard to read. So it's hard. You don't really use it. I guess that's true of the maps, and it's true of the newspapers, that they get very minimal use in the game. They are there for theme and atmosphere, which is a huge part of this game. So I love it. I love that they're these big, fantastic maps. But you won't use it very much in trying to figure out, like, could this person have gotten here? Could they have gotten here? Occasionally you'll be told that someone lives here and they work nearby, and you might look at that a little bit. But because it's so hard to read the map, you probably won't be spending too much time looking at the map other than for atmosphere. So there are the components. I guess I should say a little bit more, however, about this clue book. In addition to these clue points being so different, another huge change from Sherlock Holmes is there's a time element in the game. Every time you go look at a clue, it'll tell you how far to advance your clock. So it'll say this took 15 minutes, this took an hour. So you can expect that certain actions like fingerprinting might take a couple of hours. You only have a certain amount of time in the day. And then you'll frequently, very frequently, much more than I expected, be presented with some choices. Do you want to follow this person, or do you want to stake out their house? And when you go down a branch, you might have 3 more branches, like you're following them, and then the 2 cars split up. Do you want to follow this car? Or do you want to follow this car? And time goes by, in fact, quite a few hours. If there's some paths that if you take following someone, you could spend the whole game day doing that. It's a huge element in this game, and it presents a huge challenge to the gaminess, to the strategic decisions of the game. And maybe that's a good segue to talk about. I said I was going to keep this short. We're starting to go long. So let's talk a little bit about the success or not of some of these changes to the mechanic. First of all, as a big picture view, it's easy to see why Gumshoe why they didn't continue along the lines of Gumshoe, and why they did continue along the lines of Sherlock Holmes. It is such a sprawling, epic game. Each day, you don't finish a day and are able to answer the questions of that day. You have to basically play all 9 days before you can solve some of these mysteries, which means you're basically playing for maybe a minimum of 45 hours before you can start answering these questions. When I played this game, I took notes at the end of every day, in addition to the notes during the day. So when I played, I filled these spiral-bound pages to keep track of every clue I went on and what I heard. And then at the end of the day, I wrote up information I had gathered, fingerprints I found, etc. This game requires you to put in a lot of work, bookkeeping, a lot of note-taking. And there's a lot of reading. There's a lot of text. You have to go through the newspapers looking for one small nugget of information. There's a lot of mechanical work looking up fingerprints, etc. You have to love that kind of thing to like this game. And there are very few people who are going to want to put in that much work to play a game. And there's the phone talking again, the watch. Okay, so you have to love that kind of bookkeeping work. You have to be able to spend 5 hours chasing down a lead just to sort of narrow down a few possibilities. And if you don't take good notes, you are not going to succeed at this game. It's too long a process to keep it all in your head. Okay, so they're already a small niche that likes those Sherlock Holmes games, the narrative games where you're reading lots of text and lots of story and lots of atmosphere. And then even for the people like that, you're going to carve that into a tiny niche of people who are willing to put in the work to enjoy Sherlock Holmes, to enjoy Gumshoe. Okay, but for me, there's two parts of the Sherlock Holmes games that are fun, that are enjoyable. One is the mystery solving, deduction, figuring out the solution to the mystery and figuring out, well, where should we go next if we think this is what happened? There's that. And then there's the atmosphere and the theme and traveling back in time and feeling like you're back in the 1800s of Sherlock Holmes. And I'm in it largely for the theme and the narration. When I play those Sherlock Holmes, I feel like I've traveled back in time. I'm talking to people who are living in the 1800s. It's like reading a book, a little short story. Maybe that's the best way to think of it. Sherlock Holmes is like traveling back in time and reading a compelling short story back in the 1800s. And Gumshoe completely succeeds in capturing that for the 1930s. That atmosphere, I mean, basically now you're reading a novel. By the time you finish the 9 days, you've read a novel's worth of story and dialogue. And it completely captures that feel, that satisfying feel of humor and pathos and atmosphere. And it's completely compelling, believable. When I finished these days, I felt like I was a detective on these cases. I was a gumshoe on these cases, and I was worried about those people who are at risk, and I wanted to catch the bad guys and prove they did it. So in that respect, and for me, that is the most important respect, Gumshoe is a complete success. Now, it is less successful as a mystery deductive game. Not hugely less successful. There are mysteries to solve. They are satisfying, but it's more work than it should be sometimes to solve some of these things, and they require a little less deductive, sort of clever mystery solving, and a little more leaning on doing the shoe leather work of going through the files and checking stuff, and leaning a little more heavily on note-taking and a little less heavily on making brilliant insights. So if you're here for the complete puzzle solving and you don't care that much about the story and atmosphere, then this is probably in the wrong direction for you. But if you're here to be totally engrossed in this world, and you want to ratchet up the epic marathon nature, if you're the person who wants the marathon game, then I cannot recommend this highly enough. It is a unique experience. I cannot think of any other board game I've played that captures this kind of scope of a project. And while you're playing it, you are, at least I was, amazed at the quality of the writing and how few, just a tiny number of errors. If you know these Sherlock Holmes games, it's quite common for them to have errors and typos and mistakes. This game has very, very few. And as a time capsule, as a 1985 time capsule of 1930s, it's sort of working on a couple different levels. When you play this game, you'll feel like you're traveling back. You're in a different time. You're in the 80s style games of the sort of lo-fi. There are no apps. There's no internet. And then it's transporting you back to the 30s. So I guess bottom line, if you're watching this, if you want something really epic, if you're willing to put in the work, and it will require work, then absolutely this is worth tracking down on eBay and get yourself a second edition copy, because the first edition has many more errors, but the second edition remarkably few. And take it seriously enough to make notes. I used Google Docs. Every day I went and updated it. You can see here are my notes for the gameplay, and there's like 25 pages of notes here. It's serious. It's a serious task. There's one review on BGG that's nice and concise and sums it up quite well. You might want to just read that for a quick review. But yeah, what else needs to be said? The hardest part to get over in this game is the time element, because if you're playing it solo, you're going to have to play each day multiple times, and you're going to have a decision to make about how to do that. Do you want to play a day fully and keep very careful track of your time and then replay it again and do the same thing? Or when you get to a point in a day where it says, do you want to do A or B? Do you want to just read A, read B? You have choices about that. I'll talk more about those in a little quick video about if you want to play Gumshoe, here's how you should approach it. So that'll be a separate video from this. Let's see. What more needs to be said? All right, so if I had to give this a rating, after the first day, I was like, this is a 10. This is an amazing, unique experience. It's amazing to get to the end of the day and know that it's not time to solve the case. After 7 hours, you're just beginning to solve the case. So I started off thinking this was a 10. By the time I got to the halfway through the cases, I was ready to drop it down to a 9. So I think for me, this is a 9. It's not perfection, just because the mysteries aren't quite as satisfying. They sort of wrap up a little, they wrap up unceremoniously with just a sort of a matter-of-fact thing. So you're like, I wanted a little more story in there, a little more reward for having figured it out. And the timing element makes it a little hard. It doesn't work perfectly. It's easy to see why they gave it up after this, but it's so ambitious. If you appreciate seeing someone really reach for the stars, that's its own reward. Okay, so for me, this is a 9, and if you're the right audience, go for it. And so this was my overall overview and review and general thoughts, but I'll come back for a second video and talk more in detail about some of these things. So I hope you enjoy it. Let me know if you've played Gumshoe. There's just a tiny number of people who've played it, so it would be interesting to hear other thoughts. And I'll see you in the next video.